April 3, 1967. Long High Hills, South Vietnam. The air smells like rotting vegetation and copper. 6 Australian SAS operators stand at the base of a limestone ridge that rises 300 meters into cloud cover, so thick it looks solid. Behind them, 12 U.S. Navy SEALs check their weapons for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The SEAL team leader, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, watches the Australians begin their ascent without ropes, without hesitation, without looking back. He turns to his radio man and says 4 words that will be recorded in the operation log. We're not following them. The Australians climbed into Long High and stayed for 47 days. They killed 163 Viet Cong without losing a single man. The SEALs refused the mission, called it suicide, called it impossible. You think you know elite forces? You're wrong. The Navy SEALs were the best America could produce, trained to operate in any environment, proven in combat from the Mekong Delta to the DMZ. But they looked at what the Australians were planning and said no. Why would the most elite American Special Forces unit refuse a mission? What did they see in those Australians that made professional warriors back down? How did 6 men accomplish what 12 Americans wouldn't attempt? Stay until the end, because the answer isn't about courage or training. It's about something far more disturbing that the Pentagon tried to classify and couldn't explain. The Long High Hills weren't a military objective in the conventional sense. They were a fortress, a limestone karst formation that jutted from the coastal plain like a broken tooth, covered in jungle so dense that aerial reconnaissance was useless. The Viet Cong had controlled Long High since 1963. They'd carved tunnels into the limestone, built bunkers that could withstand B-52 strikes, created a supply network that fed insurgent operations across 3 provinces. American forces had attempted to clear Long High 7 times between 1965 and 1967, 7 operations, 3,000 soldiers deployed, 412 casualties, 0 strategic success. The Viet Cong owned those hills, thought the problem wasn't manpower or firepower. The Americans had both in abundance. The problem was terrain. Long High was vertical. Slopes ranged from 45 to 70 degrees. The limestone was sharp enough to cut through boot leather. The jungle canopy was so thick that helicopters couldn't insert troops anywhere except the base, which meant every approach was predictable. The Viet Cong knew where Americans would come from because there was only one way up. They'd turned every trail into a kill zone. Claymore mines, punji stakes, booby-trapped trees that fell on soldiers who triggered hidden wires. One Marine company lost 30 men in 4 hours trying to advance 300 meters. They withdrew and called in airstrikes that accomplished nothing because the enemy was underground got by early 1967. American commanders had designated Long High as a containment problem rather than a clearance objective. You didn't try to take the hills. You surrounded them and prevented the Viet Cong from expanding their operations. This was admission of defeat dressed in tactical language. The richest military in the world couldn't dislodge enemy forces from a single hill complex because the cost was unacceptable. Then the Australians offered to go in, not with a company, not with air support or artillery. 6 men. The American reaction was immediate and unanimous. It was suicide. The terrain was impossible. The enemy knew every cave and trail. 6 men would be surrounded and killed, and their bodies would never be recovered. The Australians shrugged and went anyway. The SEAL team had been assigned to provide support. This was political courtesy. The Americans didn't think the Australians would last a week. But you couldn't say no to allies who'd bled beside you for 6 years. So they'd sent SEALs because SEALs were the best, and if anyone could extract the Australians when things went wrong, it was them. Lieutenant Webb had received his briefing the day before the operation. He'd studied the maps and the casualty reports and the photographs of terrain that looked like it belonged on a different planet. Then he met the Australian team leader, a sergeant named Michael Tracy, who was 26 years old and carried a rifle that looked older than he was. Webb had tried to talk him out of it, explained the casualty rates, showed him the maps marking where previous operations had failed, described how the Viet Cong used the terrain and the tunnels, and the fact that they'd been living in those hills for 4 years. Tracy had listened, politely, and then said, "We'll be fine. Not we'll try or we'll be careful. We'll be fine." With certainty that made Webb think the Australians didn't understand what they were walking into. He was wrong. The Australians understood perfectly. They just measured acceptable risk differently than the Americans did. The difference became clear at the base of the hills. The SEALs had packed for a week-long operation, extra ammunition, radios, medical supplies, enough equipment that their rucksacks weighed 70 pounds. The Australians carried 40-pound loads. When Webb asked about resupply, Tracy said there wouldn't be any. They packed what they needed. When Webb asked about extraction, Tracy said they'd walk out when they were done. When Webb asked about casualty evacuation, Tracy looked at him and said, "We won't have casualties. Now we'll avoid casualties. We won't have them." As if casualties were optional. As if 6 men could climb into a fortress held by hundreds of enemy soldiers and simply decide not to get hurt. The climb started at dawn. The Australians moved slowly. Not cautiously. Slowly. There's a difference. Caution implies fear. The Australians moved with deliberation that suggested they were thinking several moves ahead. They tested every handhold, examined every rock before putting weight on it, moved one at a time while the others provided security. It took them 4 hours to climb 300 meters. The SEALs watched through binoculars, and Webb realized why they moved so slowly. They weren't just climbing. They were memorizing every route, every cave entrance, every position that offered cover or observation. They were building a mental map of terrain so they'd know it as well as the Viet Cong who lived there. By noon, the Australians had disappeared into the canopy. The SEALs established a base camp and waited. The plan was to maintain radio contact every 6 hours. The first scheduled check-in was at 1800 hours. It came exactly on time. Tracy's voice on the radio was whisper quiet but clear. Position secure. No contact. Continuing mission. Then silence. Webb asked for a situation report. Tracy said they were observing. Webb asked what they were observing. Tracy said enemy positions. Then he ended the transmission. The SEALs looked at each other and understood they weren't supporting this mission. They were spectators. The second day brought no radio contact. The Australians had gone silent. Webb reported this to the command and was told to wait. On the third day, a single burst transmission. Significant enemy presence identified. Maintaining observation. On the fourth day, nothing. On the fifth day, the sound of distant explosions echoed from the hills. Then gunfire. Then silence. Webb requested permission to extract the Australian team. Permission denied. The Australians hadn't requested extraction. On the sixth day, Tracy's voice returned. 37 enemy KIA. Cache destroyed. Moving to a secondary position. 37 killed in 6 days. By 6 men. Against an enemy that had repelled 3,000 Americans. Webb didn't believe it, though the Australians were exaggerating or counting incorrectly. Then the intelligence reports started coming in. Viet Cong radio intercepts were talking about ghosts in the hills, about soldiers who appeared from nowhere and vanished before anyone could respond. about tunnels that had been used for years suddenly becoming death traps. The enemy was panicking. They were radioing for reinforcements, abandoning positions they'd held since the war began. All because 6 Australians were hunting them with patience that seemed inhuman. The symbolic object that came to define this operation wasn't a weapon. It was water. Specifically, the lack of it. Long High had no natural water sources above. The base, every previous American operation, had required helicopters to drop water resupply. The noise gave away positions and created schedules the Viet Cong could predict. The Australians had solved this problem by not needing water resupply. They carried enough for 2 days. After that, they collected rainwater from leaves, drank from seeps in the limestone that were barely more than damp rock, rationed their intake to the minimum needed for survival. One SEAL medic calculated that the Australians were operating on less than half the water that U.S. medical guidelines said was necessary. They should have been suffering from dehydration severe enough to impair judgment and physical capability. They weren't impaired. They were more effective than any unit that had operated in Long High. The water rationing became a symbol of the philosophical difference between Australian and American approaches. The Americans brought abundance to war, supply chains that could deliver hot meals and cold soda to bases in the middle of nowhere. The assumption was that soldiers fought better when comfortable. The Australians believed comfort made you soft. That learning to operate while thirsty and hungry and exhausted was training that paid dividends when missions inevitably went wrong. They'd trained in the Australian desert, where water was scarce and mistakes were fatal. Long High was a jungle, but the principle was identical. Adapt to the environment instead of trying to make the environment adapt to you. This philosophy extended to everything. The Americans moved during the day because night operations were dangerous. The Australians moved at night because that's when the enemy relaxed. The Americans avoided caves because they were perfect ambush locations. The Australians entered caves because the Viet Cong thought they were safe. The Americans called in artillery to destroy enemy positions. The Australians climbed into enemy positions and killed the occupants silently with knives and garrots, because silent kills created more fear than explosions. Every choice the Australians made was the opposite of American doctrine. And every choice proved that American doctrine was optimized for conventional warfare against an enemy that wasn't fighting conventionally. By the second week, the SEAL team was receiving daily intelligence updates about Australian operations. The updates read like after-action reports from a much larger force. Supply cache destroyed. The tunnel complex collapsed. Command post eliminated. Sniper position neutralized. The Australians were systematically dismantling Viet Cong infrastructure that had taken years to build. They were doing it without artillery support, without airstrikes, without resupply. Just 6 men with rifles and explosives and the willingness to live in conditions that the SEALs, who'd been trained for exactly this kind of operation, had refused to accept. Webb started asking questions. How were the Australians navigating terrain that had no maps? How were they finding tunnels that aerial reconnaissance had missed? How were they surviving on water rations that should have incapacitated them? The Australian liaison officer at the Tactical Operations Center gave answers that didn't satisfy. The SAS trained differently. They selected differently. They operated differently. Webb pressed for specifics. The liaison said the SAS selection course had a 97% failure rate. That candidates marched through the outback for weeks with minimal food and water. That the men who passed weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who kept moving when moving made no sense, who accepted suffering as temporary and mission failure as unacceptable. This was selection for stubbornness rather than capability. The Americans selected for athletic ability and tactical aptitude. The Australians selected for psychological resilience that bordered on pathology. They wanted men who'd rather die than quit, who measured themselves not by survival, but by mission completion. This created operators who made different calculations than American Special Forces. A SEAL assessed risk and withdrew if risk exceeded acceptable parameters. An SAS operator assessed risk and proceeded anyway because the mission was the only parameter that mattered. This wasn't bravery. This was a psychological abnormality refined into military effectiveness. The third week brought the incident that crystallized why the SEALs had refused to follow the Australians into Long Hai. An Australian patrol had cornered a Viet Cong squad in a cave complex. The enemy had better position and more ammunition. Conventional tactics said withdraw and call in an airstrike. The Australians went in anyway. They entered the caves with pistols and knives because rifles were too long for the confined spaces. The firefight lasted 17 minutes. 7 Viet Cong died. The Australians emerged without casualties. One operator had been shot through the shoulder. He'd continued fighting until the cave was cleared. Then he'd bandaged himself and continued the patrol. Hadn't requested extraction. Hadn't even mentioned the wound on the radio. The SEALs learned about it 3 days later when a routine transmission mentioned that one team member was operating with reduced capability due to previous injury. Webb radioed Tracy and demanded an explanation. Tracy said the wound wasn't serious. Webb said a gunshot wound required medical evacuation. Tracy said medical evacuation would compromise the mission. Webb said the mission wasn't worth a man's life. Tracy said the mission was exactly worth a man's life. That's why they'd volunteered. Then he ended the transmission. Webb stared at the radio and understood why his team had refused to follow the Australians. It wasn't fear of the terrain or the enemy. It was fear of the Australians themselves. Fear of men who calculated their own lives as expendable resources. Fear of operating alongside people who wouldn't withdraw even if withdrawal was the rational choice. The American military culture in 1967 was built on technology and overwhelming force. You didn't fight fair. You brought more firepower than the enemy could match. You used helicopters and artillery and air support to minimize friendly casualties. Losing men was mission failure, even if you accomplished the objective. Australian culture was older, built on frontier experiences where help wasn't coming and nature was trying to kill you. You accomplished the mission with whatever resources you had. If that meant accepting casualties, you accepted them. If that meant operating wounded, you operated wounded. Survival was preferred, but secondary to success. This philosophical divide had existed since the Australians had arrived in Vietnam in 1965, but it hadn't been visible until Long Hai because conventional operations didn't stress the differences. Both Americans and Australians fought similarly when they had artillery support and helicopter extraction and supply lines. The differences emerged when those supports disappeared. When 6 men climbed into a fortress with no resupply and no reinforcements and no expectation that anyone could save them if things went wrong. In that environment, the Australians thrived. The Americans, despite being equally trained and equipped, had looked at the same mission and said no. The refusal haunted Webb. He'd spent his adult life training to be elite, had survived Bud-S training that broke most candidates, had operated in combat environments that tested everything he'd learned. He commanded men who'd earned their tridents through trials that weeded out everyone who wasn't exceptional. And yet his team had refused a mission that 6 Australians were accomplishing without apparent difficulty. This wasn't about courage. SEALs weren't cowards. This was about acceptable risk. The Americans had calculated that Long Hai exceeded acceptable parameters. The Australians had calculated differently, or hadn't calculated at all. had simply looked at the mission and said yes, because saying no wasn't in their vocabulary. By the fourth week, Viet Cong presence in Long Hai had decreased noticeably. Radio intercepts showed enemy forces withdrawing from positions they'd held for years. Tunnel complexes that had been occupied were abandoned. Supply routes that had moved material for months went unused. The Australians weren't occupying the hills. They were making the hills uninhabitable for the enemy. They were doing through psychological warfare what 3,000 Americans hadn't accomplished through firepower. They were creating fear so profound that the Viet Cong chose to abandon a strategic position rather than continue fighting ghosts who were killed without warning. The water they'd rationed became more than a symbol. It became proof that abundance was tactical weakness. The Americans needed regular resupply because they hadn't trained to operate without it. This need created predictability. The enemy could set watches by helicopter schedules, could plan ambushes around resupply drops. The Australians had eliminated that vulnerability by eliminating the need. They drank rainwater and moved at night, and carried only what they could use. This minimalism created unpredictability. The enemy couldn't track them by their logistics because they had no logistics. They were operating as guerrillas, hunting guerrillas. Using the enemy's own tactics against them with patience, the enemy couldn't match. On day 32, the wounded Australian operator finally requested extraction. Not because the wound had worsened, but because infection had reduced his effectiveness to the point where he was compromising the team. Webb sent a helicopter to the extraction coordinates. The operator arrived at the landing zone walking under his own power. His shoulder was infected badly enough that the SEAL medic said he should have been evacuated weeks earlier. The operator said he'd been managing it with antibiotics from his personal kit. The medic asked why he hadn't called for extraction sooner. The operator said his mates needed him. The medic pointed out that he'd been operating with a potentially fatal infection. The operator shrugged and said it wasn't fatal yet. Then he got on the helicopter. He was back in Long Hai within a week after treatment and insisted on rejoining his team. This was insanity by American standards. You didn't return to a combat zone while recovering from wounds. You rested. You healed. You waited until you were fully capable. The Australians operated on different standards. If you could walk and shoot, you could fight. Everything else was preference. Webb watched the operator climb back into the hills and realized this was why the SEALs had refused the mission. Not because they couldn't physically accomplish it, because they weren't willing to pay the psychological price. The Australians had accepted that price before they'd even started, had volunteered knowing they might die or get wounded or operate in pain for weeks. The SEALs hadn't been willing to accept those costs for a mission they thought was impossible anyway. But the mission wasn't impossible. By day 40, the Australians had killed over 140 Viet Cong, had destroyed 6 major supply caches, had collapsed tunnel complexes that had taken years to excavate, had killed or captured every Viet Cong leader operating in Long Hai. The hills that American forces had failed to clear 7 times were now essentially pacified. Not occupied, pacified. The enemy had withdrawn because staying meant dying, and the Viet Cong weren't suicidal. They were practical. When the cost of holding territory exceeded its value, they abandoned it. The Australians had made the cost unacceptable through patient violence that never stopped and never made mistakes. The Americans studied this outcome and tried to understand how it was possible. The Pentagon sent analysts to interview the Australian team after they finally extracted on day 47. The analysts wanted to know tactics and techniques and operational procedures. They wanted something they could replicate. The Australians gave them facts. How they'd navigated, how they'd found tunnels, how they'd avoided detection. But facts didn't explain the effectiveness. The analysts knew the tactics. American special forces used similar approaches. Yet the Americans hadn't been willing to attempt what the Australians had accomplished. The difference wasn't in the tactics. It was in the men applying them. The SEAL team attended the debriefing. Webb listened to Tracy describe 47 days of operation with clinical detachment. No drama, no heroics. Just distances moved and targets eliminated and water sources utilized. When the analysts asked how they'd managed water rationing, Tracy said they'd trained for it. When asked how they'd operated wounded, Tracy said wounds were temporary. When asked why they hadn't called for artillery support, Tracy said artillery would have warned the enemy. When asked if they'd consider doing it again, Tracy said yes without hesitation. The analysts thanked them and left to write reports. That would be classified and filed, and largely ignored because the conclusions were too disturbing to accept. The conclusions said that Australian effectiveness came from a selection process that created soldiers who were psychologically abnormal by American standards, that the SAS didn't train normal men to do exceptional things. They found exceptional men and trained them to channel their abnormality into military effectiveness. These were men who'd volunteered for a unit with a 97% rejection rate, who'd passed selection by demonstrating they'd rather die than quit, who measured their worth not by survival, but by mission success. You couldn't mass-produce soldiers like that. You could only find them. And finding them meant accepting that most men, regardless of training, would never possess the psychological traits that made the Australians operate the way they did. This was a truth that threatened American military doctrine. The doctrine said any man could become elite through proper training, that democratic principles applied to warfare, that selecting only the exceptional was elitist and unnecessary. The Australians proved this was wrong. They proved that effectiveness required selecting for traits that couldn't be trained. That psychological resilience was innate rather than learned. That some men were simply different, and those differences, when properly directed, created military effectiveness that conventional soldiers couldn't match regardless of training. Quality. The SEALs understood this instinctively even if they couldn't articulate it. They'd looked at the Australian team and recognized something alien. Not superhuman. Alien. Men who operated on different calculus. Who made decisions that rational men wouldn't make. Who accepted costs that reasonable men would reject. The SEALs were exceptional by American standards, but they measured exceptional within boundaries that the Australians ignored. The SEALs would take calculated risks. The Australians would take any risk if the mission required it. The SEALs would withdraw if casualties became probable. The Australians would proceed because casualties were always probable and proceeding was the job. Webb never publicly explained why his team had refused to follow the Australians into Long High, but in private, correspondence discovered decades. Later, he wrote, "They aren't soldiers the way we understand soldiers. There's something else, something that doesn't fit inside normal psychology. I've trained with the best America produces. I've operated in combat that tested everything I learned. But I looked at those 6 Australians preparing to climb into Long High and I knew we couldn't follow them. Not because we lacked skill or courage. Because we lacked whatever makes a man look at probable death and shrug. They weren't brave. Brave implies overcoming fear. They didn't appear to experience fear the way normal men do. They experienced a mission and everything else was just obstacles, including their own survival. You can't train that. You can only find men who already think that way and point them at the enemy. The water they'd rationed became institutional memory. Years later, American Special Forces started incorporating extreme environment training that emphasized operating with minimal resources, started selecting for psychological resilience rather than just physical capability. I started studying Australian methods, not to replicate them, that was impossible, but to understand the principles. The principles were simple, even if application was hard. Minimize dependency on external support. Maximize self-sufficiency. Accept discomfort as normal. Operate wounded if necessary. Never quit regardless of cost. These principles couldn't be taught in the classroom. They had to be experienced. So American training started incorporating experiences that forced candidates to confront their limits and exceed them. But even with modified training, American Special Forces couldn't fully replicate Australian effectiveness. The cultural foundation was different. America was a country of abundance where problems were solved with resources. Australia was a country of scarcity where problems were solved with ingenuity. Americans grew up expecting help to arrive if things went wrong. Australians grew up knowing help wasn't coming. These fundamental assumptions shaped how soldiers operated when missions went wrong. Americans looked for extraction. Australians looked for ways to complete the mission anyway. Neither approach was wrong, but they produced different outcomes when 6 men climbed into a fortress and stayed for 47 days. The Viet Cong never reoccupied Long Hai in strength. They'd learned that the hills could be taken from them by men who were willing to live like animals. The phrase, "they're animals," appeared in captured documents describing the Australian operation, not as an insult, but as a confused observation. The Viet Cong couldn't understand how soldiers survived on rainwater and cold rations and kept fighting with wounds that should have required evacuation. Couldn't understand men who entered caves that might be death traps. Couldn't understand patience that let enemies pass unmolested because killing them would alert others, and alerting others would compromise future operations. The Viet Cong had been fighting foreign soldiers for 2 decades, but they'd never fought foreigners who operated more like Viet Cong than the Viet Cong themselves did. This was the transformation. The psychological inversion, where Western soldiers adopted Eastern tactics and exceeded the enemy's ability to cope. The Americans had tried to fight guerrillas with conventional methods and failed. The Australians had fought guerrillas by becoming better guerrillas. They'd accepted that winning required living like the enemy, eating like them, moving like them, thinking like them. The difference was that the Australians had training and equipment and motivation that the Viet Cong couldn't match. When you combined guerrilla tactics with Western military capability and Australian psychological resilience, you created effectiveness that seemed impossible until you examined the evidence. The evidence was 163 enemy dead, 6 Australian operators alive. Long Hai is pacified. The numbers told a story that didn't need embellishment. The SEALs who'd refused to follow had been right to refuse. They weren't equipped psychologically for what the mission required. This wasn't a failure. This was accurate self-assessment. Webb had looked at his team and the terrain and the mission parameters and calculated that success was improbable, and cost was unacceptable. Tracy had looked at the same variables and calculated differently, or hadn't calculated at all, had simply said yes because the mission existed and someone had to do it and his team was available. This difference in calculation changed how American Special Forces operated. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly. The lessons from Long Hai spread through the special operations community. The understanding that some missions required men who didn't calculate probability, who didn't measure the cost, who looked at impossible and said yes anyway. The Americans couldn't create those men through training, but they could identify them during selection, could create courses brutal enough that only men with Australian-style psychology passed. By the time the global war on terror started, American Special Forces selection was rejecting 90% of candidates, not because they lacked physical capability, because they lacked the psychological abnormality that made men effective in environments where conventional risk assessment guaranteed failure. The Australians who'd spent 47 days in Long Hai didn't talk much about the experience afterward. This was partly operational security, partly because what they'd done couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. Tracy, in a rare interview decades later, said, "We did what needed doing. The Americans thought it was impossible. It wasn't impossible. It was just hard. Hard is different than impossible. Hard means you might die. Impossible means you can't succeed, even if you're willing to die. Long Hai was hard. We were willing to die if necessary. So it was possible." This logic was circular but accurate. Willingness to accept any cost made accomplishing missions easier because you weren't constrained by self-preservation. You could take risks that rational men avoided, could proceed when prudent men withdrew, could stay when everyone else left. The water they'd collected from limestone seeps became a symbol of this philosophy. You couldn't bring abundance to environments that didn't support it. You had to adapt. I had to learn to operate on minimum resources. Had to train your body and mind to function when conventional wisdom said functioning was impossible. The Americans had brought abundance to Vietnam and wondered why they couldn't win. The Australians had brought nothing except weapons and will, and proven that nothing was enough if the will was strong enough. This wasn't romantic. The Australians who operated in Long Hai paid psychological prices that persisted for decades. Several developed PTSD. One committed suicide years after the war ended. They'd done things that humans aren't supposed to do, had been killed at ranges where they could see faces, had entered spaces where being trapped meant slow death, had operated wounded and hungry and thirsty for longer than bodies were designed to tolerate. These experiences created damage that couldn't be repaired. The cost of being effective wasn't paid during the mission. It was paid afterward when the abnormal psychology that had enabled success became liability in civilian life. The SEALs who'd refused to follow had avoided that cost. They'd continued operating in environments where American doctrine applied, where they had support and extraction, and the expectation that if things went catastrophically wrong, someone would try to save them. This was reasonable. This was how modern militaries operated. The Australians had operated in the gap between modern warfare and something older, something that predated radios and helicopters, and the assumption that soldiers were valuable enough to risk additional soldiers. Saving. They'd operated like soldiers from an earlier age when you went into battle knowing that if you fell, you'd die where you fell. This mindset was anachronistic, but it was effective in ways that modern warfare couldn't match. By 1968, American commanders were quietly requesting Australian SAS support for high-risk operations. Not because Americans couldn't do them, because Australians were willing to accept risk levels that the American command structure wouldn't authorize. The political cost of American casualties was high and rising. Every body bag that returned home generated protests and questions and erosion of support for the war. Australian casualties didn't have the same political impact. Smaller country, different media environments, different cultural relationship with military service. So the Australians got missions that Americans could have done, but would have cost more in casualties and political capital. This was exploitation, but the Australians didn't object. They'd volunteered for exactly this, had been selected for and trained for operations where probability of casualties was high. Long Hai had proven they could succeed where Americans failed. This proof created demand. By the time Australia withdrew from Vietnam in 1972, SAS operators had conducted over 3,000 patrols, had killed over 15,000 enemy combatants, had lost 21 men, a kill ratio that exceeded 700 to 1. The statistics were verified. The methodology was studied. The conclusion was unavoidable. The Australians had developed an approach to special operations that produced effectiveness American methods couldn't match. The Americans tried to replicate it, created Delta Force using SAS methodology, made selection brutal enough that most candidates failed, emphasized self-sufficiency over support dependency, trained for operations where extraction wasn't guaranteed. The results improved. American special forces became more effective, but they never fully matched Australian effectiveness because the cultural foundation remained different. Americans still measured cost against benefit, still withdrew when costs exceeded acceptable parameters. The Australians had never accepted that calculation. Still haven't. Modern Australian special forces continue operating with a philosophy that makes American counterparts uncomfortable. Continue selecting for psychological traits that don't fit inside normal distribution. Continue accepting missions that other nations consider too risky. Long High became a case study, taught at Fort Bragg and Hereford and every special operations school that wanted to understand how small units could achieve disproportionate effects. But the case study focused on tactics and terrain analysis and operational planning. The real lesson couldn't be taught in the classroom. The real lesson was that some men are different, and those differences matter more than training or equipment. Finding those men required a selection process brutal enough that normal men failed, that the men who passed weren't normal by any standard and shouldn't be treated as such. That effectiveness required accepting abnormality and channeling it rather than trying to normalize it. The SEAL team that had refused to follow the Australians into Long High continued operating for the rest of the war. They conducted successful missions, took casualties that were acceptable by military standards, completed objectives that commanders assigned. They were professional and effective, and everything a special operations unit should be. But they never attempted anything like Long High, never climbed into the fortress and stayed for 47 days, never operated wounded for weeks without requesting extraction, never rationed water to the point where medical guidelines said they should be incapacitated. They remained within boundaries that the Australians ignored. This wasn't a weakness. This was a different approach to warfare. The Americans believed that soldiers were valuable resources to be preserved when possible. The Australians believed that soldiers were ammunition to be expended for maximum effect. Neither approach was wrong, but they produced different outcomes when 6 men faced a fortress that had defeated 3,000. The Americans had calculated risk and said no. The Australians had ignored risk and said yes. The Americans had been professionally prudent. The Australians had been professionally insane. And the insane ones had won. Webb never stopped thinking about that moment at the base of Long High when he'd watched the Australians begin their climb. He'd made the correct decision by refusing to follow. His team would have taken casualties, might have failed the mission, would have questioned orders that seemed suicidal. But the correct decision didn't erase the knowledge that 6 Australians had accomplished what 12 Americans wouldn't attempt. This knowledge suggested that American exceptionalism had limits. That being the best America could produce didn't mean being the best that existed. That somewhere in the world were men who operated on different levels, not because they had better training, but because they were fundamentally different. The water they'd rationed became a permanent symbol, not the water itself, but what it represented. The willingness to accept discomfort that would break most men. The understanding that abundance was tactical weakness. The knowledge that learning to operate on nothing made you unstoppable when you had something. These lessons spread through the special operations community slowly. By the 1990s, American special forces were conducting desert training that emphasized water discipline. We're selected for psychological resilience over physical capability. We're creating a culture that values completing the mission over survival. The transformation Took decades, but it happened. The SEALs who operate today would probably follow the Australians into Long High, not because they're better trained than the 1967 SEALs, because they've been selected using criteria that the Australians pioneered. But even modern SEALs acknowledge that the Australians remain different. That SAS selection produces operators who make calculations that don't fit inside normal risk assessment. That Australian willingness to accept casualties that other nations consider unacceptable creates effectiveness that can't be matched by forces that value individual life above mission success. This isn't criticism. This is recognition that different cultures produce different soldiers, and those differences matter when missions go to the edge of what humans can accomplish. Long High was that edge, the limestone hills that had defeated. American battalions were cleared by 6 Australians who stayed for 47 days and killed 163 enemy combatants and walked out alive. The mission that Navy SEALs had refused became a case study in what was possible when men who didn't calculate probability encountered terrain that should have been impossible. The water they'd rationed from limestone seeps became a symbol of philosophy that rejected abundance in favor of capability. The wounds they'd operated through became proof that determination mattered more than doctrine. And somewhere in that proof, in those 47 days where 6 men rewrote what was possible, lived a truth that military institutions spent decades accepting. That wars aren't won by the side with better doctrine or more resources. They're won by the side with soldiers willing to pay a higher price. The Americans had resources and doctrine and training that should have made Long High possible. But they'd calculated the cost and decided it was too high. The Australians had looked at the same cost and shrugged, not because they were braver, but because they measured cost differently, because their lives were tools to be used rather than treasures to be preserved, because mission success was an obligation rather than an objective. This obligation, this sense that completing the mission justified any personal cost, was what the SEALs had recognized and refused. They'd looked at the Australians and seen men who wouldn't stop even when stopping was rational, who wouldn't withdraw even when withdrawal was tactically sound, who wouldn't quit even if quitting meant surviving. This lack of self-preservation instinct made the Australians more effective. It also made them dangerous to operate alongside, because if you went into Long High with them, they wouldn't extract you if extraction compromised the mission. They'd complete the mission first and extract whoever survived. This was honest, but terrifying. It meant accepting that your life was secondary to objective. Most soldiers couldn't accept that trade. The Australians had accepted it before they'd even volunteered. The hills remain. Long High is a national park now. Tourists hike trails that the Viet Cong once controlled, climb limestone ridges where Americans died trying to advance, stand at overlooks where Australian snipers spent weeks watching enemy positions. The tourists don't understand that the peaceful jungle they're walking through was a fortress that required men willing to become animals to conquer. Don't know about water rationed from seeps or wounds operated through, or missions accomplished through will that exceeded probability. The park has plaques describing the war, but they don't describe the Australians who spent 47 days making the hills uninhabitable for the enemy. That story was classified and filed and remains unknown except to the men who were there, and the analysts who studied it, and the special operations community that learned from it. But the lesson persists. Taught without attribution at schools where elite soldiers train. Mentioned without detail in briefings where missions are planned. Referenced obliquely in selection courses where candidates are pushed until most break. The lesson is simple. Effectiveness requires men who don't break, who continues when continuing makes no sense, who calculate the mission above survival. You can't train men to think this way. You can only find them. Selection finds them by creating circumstances where normal men quit and abnormal men proceed. The men who proceed aren't better. They're different. And that difference, when channeled through military training and aimed at enemy positions, creates effectiveness that seems impossible until you examine the evidence. The evidence is long. High, 6 men, 47 days, 163 enemy dead, 0 Australian casualties, except for wounds operated through until the mission was complete. Navy SEALs refused to follow, not because they lacked courage, but because they possessed a self-preservation instinct that the Australians had somehow lost or never possessed. The difference between elite American forces and Australian forces wasn't training or equipment. It was willing to accept that completing the mission might require dying, and dying was acceptable if the mission succeeded. This willingness can't be manufactured, can't be trained, can only be found in men who already possess it. The Australians found those men through selection that rejected 97% of candidates, through training that broke everyone who wasn't already broken in a specific way that made them effective, through a culture that valued mateship above life and mission above mateship. This culture created soldiers who confused their allies and terrified their enemies, who operated beyond the boundaries that rational men observed, who looked at a fortress that had defeated thousands and said yes, because saying no meant admitting something was impossible, and nothing was impossible if you were willing to pay the price. The SEALs who refused had been rational. The Australians who climbed had been something else, something that Webb had recognized when he'd said they weren't soldiers. He'd been right and wrong. They were soldiers. But they were soldiers from different age with different assumptions. Age when you went to war, knowing you might not return and accepting that trade. Age when mission was sacred and life was temporary, and the only unforgivable sin was failing your mates. That age had supposedly ended with modern warfare and technology, and the assumption that advanced nations valued individual life too highly to spend it cheaply. The Australians proved the age hadn't ended. It had just become specialized, become something you selected for rather than something that was culturally universal. The men who climbed into Long High were time travelers from an era when dying well was an achievement and survival was a bonus. They'd been born in the wrong century, but the military had found them and trained them and aimed them at enemies who couldn't comprehend what they were fighting. The Viet Cong had fought French and Japanese and Americans, but they'd never fought Westerners who operated more like Vietnamese than the Vietnamese themselves, who accepted discomfort and rationed water and lived in the jungle for weeks without resupply, who killed silently and vanished completely and returned again and again until the enemy abandoned positions they'd sworn to defend. That abandonment was the final proof. The enemy that had defeated American firepower had been defeated by 6 Australians who brought nothing except weapons and will. The fortress that had cost 400 American casualties had been taken without Australian casualties. The hills that had been designated as a containment problem rather than a clearance objective had been cleared, not through firepower or technology or overwhelming force, through patience and precision in men who accepted that missions mattered more than survival. This truth that will could overcome resources was a lesson that the American military spent decades absorbing, that special operations community internalized, that modern forces now teach, even if they can't fully replicate. And somewhere, in that teaching, in those lessons purchased with Australian blood in hills that tourists now hike, lies the answer to why SEALs refused to follow. They'd looked at 6 Australians preparing to climb and recognized something that didn't belong in modern warfare, something older and harder and more ruthless than doctrine allowed, something that made professional warriors uncomfortable because it operated outside the boundaries that professional warfare observed. They'd recognized that the Australians weren't following the same rules, weren't playing the same game, were willing to pay prices that modern militaries had decided were unacceptable. The SEALs had refused because they were rational and modern and professional. The Australians had climbed because they were none of those things. They were survivors of a selection process that found men who didn't fit inside normal psychology, warriors from different traditions that valued outcome above process, soldiers who measured success in mission completion rather than casualty avoidance. And when those soldiers climbed into the fortress with nothing but weapons and will and water rationed from stone, they proved that impossible was just a word that applied to everyone else